We'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, and thank you everybody for joining. I'd like to welcome everyone to week 8 of the 2024 Watershed Wednesdays series. I'm Emily Dekar, the Agricultural Coordinator for the Upper Susquehanna Coalition. Watershed Wednesdays are hosted by the Upper Susquehanna Coalition and the Otsego County Conservation Association. We'll be holding sessions every Wednesday through November 20th this year. The full schedule is posted on our website and on the Facebook page. You can also sign up for email announcements on the USC website under the Watershed Wednesdays tab. The sessions are recorded and can be accessed on the USC website at a later date. To get things started today, our presenter is Jimmy Weber. Jimmy serves as a hydrologist for the U.S. Geological Survey, Virginia and West Virginia Water Science Center. He holds a Master's of Science in Forest Resources from the Pennsylvania State University. He's primarily involved in nutrient and sediment transport studies in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. His research interests include understanding the fate and transport of surface water contaminants through coupled monitoring and modeling activities. Jimmy's going to give you an overview of evaluating water quality trends in agricultural watersheds prioritized for management. So with that, I will turn it over to Jimmy.
All right. Thanks, Emily. Thank you for having me here, and thanks to everyone on the phone for joining the call. I'm going to share some research that was published this past year about water quality conditions in 3 agricultural watersheds that were targeted for enhanced amount of conservation activities. This will probably be 15-20 minutes or so of material, and then I'm hoping we can use the last part of the conversation to address your feedback and have question and answer period. So we'll leave some time for that. So I want to acknowledge my co-authors who've contributed to this work, Jeff Chanett, John Clune, Olivia Devereaux, Natalie Hall, Robert Sabo, and Chen Zhang. This was a great collaborative team, a mix of USGS folks, academic researchers, and really a good group all thinking about water quality conditions in the Chesapeake. So in way of background for this study, I'm talking about work that largely began in around 2010, when the USGS partnered with USDA and EPA to initiate enhanced amounts of water quality monitoring in 3 agricultural watersheds in the Chesapeake Bay drainage area. These 3 watersheds were selected by USDA as areas where they thought they could get a lot of conservation buy-in and a lot of voluntary efforts to install water quality BMPs in these areas. So you can see the 3 watersheds all represent different agricultural settings in the Chesapeake Bay drainage. We have the Conewago Creek watershed in southeastern Pennsylvania, the Upper Chester River watershed on Maryland's eastern shore, and then the Smith Creek watershed down here in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. These watersheds are all between about 30 and 100 square miles, so they are smaller than some of the monitoring stations that USGS typically works at. In these 3 watersheds, the USGS brought enhanced amounts of water quality monitoring, but we worked with local partners to get all the voluntary conservation practices on the ground. So that's not the work that USGS does. That's all of the local, state, and federal partners who are working with farmers in these areas to cost share and get additional BMPs on the ground during the study period. So since 2010, we've been monitoring these streams with a goal of understanding how water quality is changing over time and the drivers of water quality response. I want to highlight some important messages that we ended up finding after about 10 years worth of work, and all of this was published in the below link. Some of the important messages we found were that there were increasing amounts of conservation practices used in these watersheds, but we didn't find consistent decreases in nutrient and sediment loads in these areas. In some of these watersheds, it's likely that the ability of management practices to lower nutrient loads may have been offset by increasing amounts of nutrient applications in the watershed and increasing sediment loads, which can transport nutrients to the stream. So thinking about what could be really effective in these type of agricultural settings are management practices that reduce nutrient inputs to the landscape. So we're thinking about those non-point inputs like fertilizer and manure, and also practices that control the movement of that material from the uplands to streams, particularly during high flow conditions. That's when a lot of the material enters the stream and is delivered out of the watershed. But we found this work was really informative to help build our knowledge about agricultural systems and water quality responses. And ultimately, this is complex stuff, but these type of studies of paired conservation work and monitoring, partnerships of individuals from local, state, and federal levels, that type of work is what's needed to continue understanding how we can best manage these systems to address local priorities. A lot of this might sound familiar to you if you've read or seen the Caesar report. That was a large synthesis about the current state of water quality conditions and conservation in the Chesapeake. This report was authored by Kurt Stevenson from Virginia Tech and other partners through the Chesapeake Bay program. So a lot of what we found in this study is really similar to the ideas shared in that larger synthesis report about the Chesapeake. So in way of an outline here, I'm going to highlight some of the use of management practices in these watersheds, and then I'll talk about the water quality responses we observed and conclude with some nitrogen responses that we saw in one of our watersheds, Smith Creek. That Smith Creek watershed, we had about 30 years of monitoring data. So we were able to look a little bit deeper into the cause and effect relationships. In these watersheds, the use of agricultural management practices increased over time. And that's what we expected because these were showcase areas that were targeted for enhanced amounts of conservation. So we were able to work with partners and quantify the use of practices and see how those changes occurred over time. So this plot shows for each of the 3 watersheds increases in the number of agricultural management practices from 2007 through 2020. You can see the number of practices at least doubled in all of these watersheds. Not all of these practices are designed to reduce nutrients and sediment loads. That water quality perspective is kind of the interest that USGS had, but agricultural partners and landowners are using these sort of conservation practices to achieve a variety of agronomic and economic outcomes. So not all of them are designed to lower nutrients and sediment, but we were most interested in those that could. So we worked with conservation partners to identify what % of these practices had a high expectation, a high impact expectation to lower nutrients and sediment. And you can see those percentages summarized below. Each of the watersheds used a unique suite of management practices. Again, not unexpected. The use of management practices really aligned with the local priorities in the area and the local land use and agricultural activities. So on the Upper Chester River watershed, this is out on Maryland's eastern shore, we saw a number of practices designed to address cropping systems, so use of cover crops, nutrient management plans, of course, conservation tillage practices. There's a lot of row crop agriculture in that watershed, so that makes sense. In Smith Creek, this is our watershed in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. There's a lot of animal livestock production, cattle and poultry production. So we saw a number of practices designed to either control the movement of livestock with fencing, the handling of manure through animal waste management systems. So again, makes sense and is tailored to the land use of the watershed. And in Conewago Creek, this is our area in southeastern Pennsylvania. There's a mixture of agricultural activities, some crops, some animal agriculture, and we saw a mixture of practices used. But we also did see that Pennsylvania tended to tailor their suite of practices towards those that could reduce sediment. So that's just kind of an idea where local jurisdictions and partners can kind of select those practices that align with local priorities. So in Pennsylvania, there tended to be a little more practices designed to control the runoff and erosion of sediment. So let's look at some of the water quality responses that we monitored in these streams. I shared earlier that not all of the loads that we monitored decreased. We monitor these stream conditions since about the early 2010s. And one important note about the work we do, when we look at trends or changes over time, we remove the year-to-year variability associated with differences in stream flow. Whenever we're looking at loads, it's really highly correlated and tied to the amount of flow in the river. And the amount of flow in the river is really related to how much it rained that year. So we don't necessarily want to report on how much it rained. We want to remove that year-to-year difference in stream flow and look at changing nutrient and sediment loads associated with conditions in the watershed. So these results all represent those flow normalized conditions, or what we call it. So in Smith Creek, to show you graphically, we monitored total nitrogen in the stream for 10 years. and saw that the load of total nitrogen increased from 2011 through 2020. The load of nitrate increased over that same period. Total phosphorus loads increased. The dissolved fraction, that orthophosphate, that decreased during the period, and suspended sediment loads increased. So those are the 5 constituents we monitored at each station. And for Smith Creek, we saw 4 of those measurements increased, meaning that there was more load later in the year than earlier in the record. For the Upper Chester River on Maryland's eastern shore, we saw that total nitrogen and nitrate had no change over time. So that means the loads were pretty much flat from start to end, but measurements of phosphorus and sediment all increased. In Pennsylvania, we had the Conewago Creek watershed, which actually had nested stream gauges. So we had one monitoring station kind of towards the middle of the watershed and one at the bottom of the watershed. So this is the watershed, the station in the middle of the watershed, which showed increasing amounts of nitrogen, essentially a flat amount of phosphorus and a decrease in sediment. And then at the bottom of the watershed, so this is the same river just downstream in Conewago Creek, we saw decreasing loads of all measurements of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. So that's interesting that those nested watersheds showed different patterns. Overall, we saw that about half of these monitored constituents increased. So if you look at the number of orange boxes, we saw increasing loads in about half of these areas. And loads decreased for 7 of the parameters, which again, most of that came from that lower Conewago Creek watershed. We can look at the differences in total and dissolved material. So for total nitrogen, a lot of the changes were driven by nitrate. That's the dissolved fraction of nitrogen. So if you look at Smith Creek, the total nitrogen load increased by 61 kilograms per square kilometer, while the nitrate load increased by 44 kilograms per square kilometer. So a lot of the increase in total nitrogen was driven by nitrate. So that gives us some idea of where the material is coming from and how it's moving through the watershed. Phosphorus is a different story. Orthophosphate, which is a dissolved component of phosphorus, did not explain most of the changes in total phosphorus for most of the watersheds. If we look at the Upper Chester on Maryland's eastern shore here, we could see that total phosphorus increased by about 10 times the amount of orthophosphate. And what drives that is likely the movement of sediment to streams. Phosphorus can bind to sediment and reach the streams through those sediment particles. So in Upper Chester, we saw large increases in suspended sediment, which likely mobilized some of that particulate phosphorus to the streams. So just to summarize some of the other patterns we saw in these watersheds, in Smith Creek, we really took a close look at the changing loads and how that related to the application of non-point source nutrients to the landscape. So we tried to estimate the amount of manure applied in the watershed, the amount of fertilizer used, and we saw in general that those non-point source inputs increased over the monitoring period. And so what could be happening here is that BMPs might have a beneficial effect of lowering the nutrient load, but that could be overshadowed when you're adding more material to the landscape and resulting in an increased monitored load. We thought a lot about the idea of surplus inputs. So this is the idea that if you're adding more nutrient to the landscape from fertilizer and manure that is actually needed to grow the crops and for animal production, then what's left over can really readily reach the streams and be infiltrated into the landscape. So that idea of keeping the inputs in balance with the agronomic demand is something we highlighted in the paper. In our Maryland watershed, we actually saw that since 1985, the use of nutrient inputs increased by a lot. So over that multi-decadal period, 1985 through 2020, the amount of fertilizer and manure applied in the watershed went way up. But in the monitoring period, which was a recent 10-year period, we actually saw it was a slight decrease. We called it a non-statistical change. But that's an interesting story, just highlighting that although the inputs went up over multiple decades, the loads didn't increase. So maybe this is a good news story where conservation practices helped hold the line. But for phosphorus, the story was different. We saw actually a reduction in inputs, mostly because the use of phosphorus fertilizer has decreased over a multi-decadal period, but the phosphorus loads in the stream increased. And so that might be related to that movement of suspended sediment we looked at on the previous slide. And then for Conewago Creek, this is the watershed where we saw differences between an upstream and downstream location. Potentially one cause of that is changing amounts of nutrients discharged from small point sources in the watershed. There were small point source facilities that discharge nutrients to the stream between those monitoring stations, and changing amounts of discharge from those point sources might have affected the loads that we monitored. But this is also the only watershed where suspended sediment loads decreased. And again, there was a lot of BMPs used in this watershed to control sediment movement. So we are interested to continue exploring the idea that those sediment BMPs might have helped lower suspended sediment loads. So I just want to end this portion of the talk by looking in a little more detail at the nitrogen loads in Smith Creek, where we've been monitoring the stream since the 1980s. So the flow normalized load that we've monitored in Smith Creek from 1985 through 2020 has ultimately increased. So we were previously looking at kind of a recent 10-year period. This is a perspective back to the mid-80s. And we can see this black line represents the monitored load in the streams. And there's some ups, there's some downs, but particularly in these recent years, the load has increased, meaning that overall the trend is increasing in this watershed. So what caused the change? This is, of course, the million-dollar question of, is it related to climatic effects, management practices, non-point source inputs? Well, we tried to address that by looking in a little more detail, and we saw that this 30-plus year record of monitored nitrogen load looked pretty similar to the applications of manure in the watershed. So this green line is an estimated amount of manure being generated and produced in the watershed. It's based on agricultural census data at the county scale. So the estimate is certainly not perfect, but to your eye, there does appear to be a correlation here, which we did a little bit more statistical modeling work, and that suggested this is an important relationship, particularly if you lag the input by a few years. So the idea here would be that the manure is generated and applied, and then it might take a few years for that manure to move through different pathways and actually reach the streams. This makes some sense to us because we know manure is one of the largest inputs in Smith Creek, and most of it is applied in agricultural settings. Those manure loads increased over time, and that idea of a 4-year lag is similar to some of the age dating work we've done throughout the Shenandoah Valley. So that wraps up and concludes the portion of the talk about what we did. And then I want to just really briefly turn and look forward about where we're going. So some of this work is continuing with the USGS. We're working in partnership with NRCS and EPA, and we've actually identified and initiated monitoring in 5 more small agricultural watersheds. So these 5 watersheds are shown on the map. They all began this past fiscal year for the monitoring activities. And these watersheds are really small compared to what we just looked at. All of these are less than 15 square miles. Some of them are like 5 square mile areas. And so what we wanted to do with this continued work is continuing to look at the questions about conservation practice effects. But we think that working in these smaller watersheds is going to give us a better opportunity to understand and identify how changes in the landscape are affecting water quality responses. I also just want to highlight that there's a major goal with this future and ongoing work to engage communities and work with local partners. We have just continued to see the value and benefit of bringing as many people into this process as possible. So in addition to all the great water quality monitoring and quantitative work we plan to do, we're going to be working with communities, local colleges, having outreach events, and getting the community involved with this work. So these are just some pictures of some kickoff events and meetings we've already had at these watersheds. And then maybe of interest to this group more than anything is the idea that these new watersheds are continuing to come online, particularly in the upper part of the Pennsylvania watershed. In addition to what I just showed you on the last slides, these yellow station dots represent more monitoring stations that are planned to come online in recent years in Pennsylvania. These 5 stations are being funded in partnership with the Pennsylvania NRCS state office. So that's really encouraging that they want more of this work and more of it's coming to different parts of the watershed. So there's certainly opportunities to continue this partnership. USGS loves to partner with local groups to get more of this work online. So, it would be great to add some of these monitoring stations into the parts of the watershed you all think about, New York and the upper part of Pennsylvania. So that's the last slide I have. And I think maybe we'll just open it up and do a question and answer period. But I thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Jimmy. If anybody has any questions, they can put them in the chat or feel free to come off mute and ask that way.
I'm sure I didn't explain everything perfectly.
I do have a question, Jimmy.
Sure.
What would need to be done to try and get some monitoring sites in New York?
Yeah. So all of this is, the monitoring costs are usually funded in partnership with different agencies and groups. And I think I just saw a question in the chat of how is this funded? So a lot of the previous work was funded by EPA, Chesapeake Bay Program Office. The USGS certainly contributes some matching funds to these efforts. But this expanded work and some of this new work that you're seeing represents a continued investment by EPA, but we are also working in partnership with NRCS offices. So for these 5 additional stations in Pennsylvania, these yellow dots, they are all funded directly from the Pennsylvania State NRCS office. So to add more stations to the map, we would just need to work with partners that are willing and able to fund this type of monitoring activity. So that can be local governments, that can be state agencies, that can be, broader regional NRCS or EPA offices. But we don't discriminate with who we're able to work with. We're really able to work with any sort of local partner for this type of thing.
Awesome.
What kind of things need to be funded? Just the monitoring station themselves, or staff to go out and take a look? Like what exactly needs the funding?
Yeah, so these stations, what we like to do is operate a stream gauge, because that's providing the foundational information about river flow. So how much water is moving through the system. And then we also like to have staff go out and dip a bottle and send it to a lab to look at a number of water quality constituents. So those are 2 activities. And then the third piece, which is really helpful in these small systems, is to use continuous water quality instrumentation. So there's a picture of one of these instruments here shown on the slide, but these instruments give you usually 15-minute measurements of the amount of nitrate in the stream, the water temperature, the pH. So that can be really important in these small settings because the water chemistry can be really highly variable. So usually we work with partners to fund the collection of those monitoring activities. And then the interpretive work, because certainly it's not just about generating data. We want to put some interpretation on this. We want to work with partners. We want to answer questions. USGS can usually leverage some additional funding to pay for the interpretive science side of things. So usually it's the cost of monitoring that's the burden we need to kind of overcome to get one of these stations online.
So here's a really detailed question. Hopefully it's not that bad. So if we were to partner like this, like say the Upper Susquehanna Coalition partnered, we would definitely have to develop some type of quality assurance plan. I'm assuming you already have one for this type of collection, and it would be easy just to provide that.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. We could work in partnership with, we can be very creative about how all this works. Some of these stations, because the costs can be a pretty big burden for, understandably, these costs are pretty high to do this type of work. And it helps sometimes with the folks we partner with to have other agencies do some of the data collection or sampling. So some of these sites, Pennsylvania DEP are actually the ones sampling. Some of the sites we have Penn State staff actually doing the monitoring work. So sometimes there could be creative ways to kind of put the whole puzzle pieces together. But yeah, I mean, we've done this many times. So we have all the QA work and quality assurance plans developed for that type of thing.
There is another question in the chat. Was there any research done monitoring living organisms in the watershed? Did fish populations increase or decrease, for example, or any impact on plant life?
Not in this study. This was focused on nutrient and sediment work, but a lot of this was supported through our USGS Chesapeake Bay studies and Chesapeake Bay study activities. And there is a large portfolio of science that is looking at the effect of conservation practices on fish habitat, fish health, macroinvertebrates, aquatic organisms. So I can help point you in the direction of some of that research, particularly if the group would like to hear about that kind of science.
Jimmy, within the Upper Susquehanna Coalition, we don't do any water monitoring, but our partners at Susquehanna River Basin Commission
Yep.
do. And they have a bunch. I just shared a map of all of their active stations, and they do have several up in our part of the watershed. Would that data be sufficient?
Yeah, I mean, being able to leverage ongoing work at existing stations is a great way to help offset costs. So for this type of study, we'd be looking for, maybe ongoing monitoring at a small agricultural watershed. And that's usually where we find that there isn't the existing activities. We usually don't have these type of monitoring stations set up in like 5 to 10 square mile drainages that are dominated by agricultural activities. But SRBC is a great partner through so much of our Chesapeake water quality science. They are also monitoring some of these small ag streams for us. So yeah, we can be very creative about the partnerships and the collaboration. So absolutely, SRBC has done a lot of this great work too.
There's another question in the chat. Is this information being brought to farmers? Is the idea to drive legislation to change fertilizing practices, or are there perhaps incentives for farmers to use different practices?
Yeah, we have met and shared this information with local conservation groups, local watershed partnership groups. We kind of lean on those local groups to help bring out the community to those events. So it's really nice when we can leverage and work with partnerships that already have, landowners participating. USGS is a non-regulatory agency. So our information does not result in recommendations to say this is how policy should be changed, this is how legislation should be changed. Our role is to interpret the data and just tell a very unbiased and open story about here's what the data are telling us. It's kind of that network of partners that's needed to say, okay, well, who's in position then to take this information and maybe enact local ordinances or policies or things like that. But these are not new questions for many of our Chesapeake Bay partners. There's a lot of conversation about management of non-point sources, how we address these regional imbalances of manure, how we can change the incentive structure to have more conservation on the landscape. There's a lot of those kind of conversations, but USGS doesn't directly provide recommendations for policy.
Is there any other questions anybody has?
Well, I appreciate it. I'll just say thank you too. Well, people are thinking, and it's very nice to be with you here today. And if you have any questions too, you're welcome to email. You can find the paper. I think someone put it in the chat. The meeting's recorded, so it's really great to share this with you.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. And feel free to interrupt if there are any other questions or put them in the chat still. I'm going to share next week's presentation be on Wednesday, November 6th at 9:30. It is going to be New York's statewide reforestation planning effort update by JJ Cathy. She's the Resiliency Planting Coordinator, Climate, Forestry, and Carbon Unit, Bureau of Forest Resource Management, Division of Lands and Forests. So again, if anybody has any other questions, we've got about a minute left. You're welcome to put them in the chat or come off mute. Otherwise, hopefully we will see you all next week. And thank you again, Jimmy.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.